Good afternoon. I'd like to start by thanking the Alliance for the opportunity to speak today, and also thank each of you for foregoing the San Diego sunshine this afternoon for this last session. If there's a message I'd like to convey over the next few minutes, it is one that as your programs move near the clinic or into the clinic, I think it's particularly important to make sure that you choose a partner who is particularly specialized and experienced in cell and gene therapy research. CTI is an 18-year-old privately held company, multinational with associates across 25 different countries globally, and works currently with more than 100 pharmaceutical, biotech, and medical device companies, including the majority of the largest pharmaceutical companies. Since our inception, we've actually been involved with more than 100 products that have received FDA or EMA or other regulatory approvals in both the drug and the device world, and have actually worked on more than 3,000 projects over our 18-year history. The history is one where primarily we've grown organically as a result of repeat projects as sponsors that we've worked with have progressed through the clinic to approval and come back to us with additional projects. But I want to spend the majority of the time today focusing on our cell and gene therapy experience, because we feel like that is one of the richest that is out there. As I mentioned earlier, the approvals that we've been part of span a number of different therapeutic areas, and in fact, as I was listening this morning to a number of the presentations, I believe 7 companies this morning that were presenting either in this room or the room next door are current partners of CTI. We cross a number of different therapeutic areas. We have a high level of specialty, especially in critically ill and chronically ill patient populations. And in 2015 alone, you can see we had more than 15 approvals by FDA and EMA, and a number of these are in the rare disease space, which we're starting to see more and more work, especially partnered in the cell and gene therapy arena. One of the reasons that we've had the success that we've had is, as I mentioned earlier, is we do have very long-standing relationships. Some of the first companies that we worked with starting 18 years ago, we continue to support and work with today, as those companies have moved from small molecule-based to biologics to now cell and gene therapy. We feel like we've become integral to their success and to their partners. And I think when we ask them specifically why is it that they come back to us over and over again, there are a couple things that resonate. First off, they'll tell us that we have extremely high employee retention, so in fact that our team members are consistent throughout their programs, even though that they last sometimes years and years. Another thing is, having previously been on the side of biotechnology before starting this company, the importance of timelines to the investor community, to the boards, and the shareholders is particularly important. And we pride ourselves that while the industry average, if you look at the tough studies that have been published, suggests that less than 1 in 4 clinical research studies, not just in cell and gene therapy, but in general, only 1 in 4 actually meet the timelines that were initially published by the sponsor. We pride ourselves that actually 80% of our studies, even the ones that are in the rare disease population, are able to be completed either before or on time as opposed to the timelines that were initially put out there. One of the things that, if you follow the industry closely, you'll see, and I think this meeting is a good example of that, is sometimes we have timelines that are promised, we come back a year later and we find that frequently those have been delayed for many good reasons. But as an organization, we pride ourselves on meeting or beating these timelines in a very high percentage of our projects. I'd like to talk just for a moment about the service offering. So we actually start and call ourselves from a bench to commercialization organization. We're able to work with a company at a very early stage, ascertain actually the best development approach. And this involves both a commercial assessment as well as a regulatory assessment as well as a scientific assessment. So what I'm talking about here is basically a 360-degree review where we're able to look and say, what is the competitive landscape? What is the likelihood based on the mechanism? What's the likelihood based on the company's priorities? For instance, I need to get into the clinic as quick as possible in order to raise more funds. I need to get to an approval, even though it may be one that has a very narrow indication. Trying to understand these particular aspects, I think, make us a very valuable partner to the companies that we work with. We have a full-service clinical research organization. All the services that you would be used to looking for. We also have our own phase 1 research center where we can actually be a site, and in fact we are on many of our studies here in the United States. And then we also have a life cycle support and health economics outcomes research group, which is very viable and one that is actually one of our biggest growth engines. It's become increasingly popular. Years ago, people would come to us and say, I just completed my phase 3 program. I need to think about how I'm going to price this therapy. Now what happens is people come to us and say, I'm thinking investing in a product that might get approved in 6 or 7 or 8 years, and I need to know, what are the payers thinking? What is the competitive landscape going to be? What are the healthcare systems, and what's the government thinking? So we find that that has moved up much earlier in the decision process, whether it's on the venture capital side, whether it's on the biotech or the pharma side. From an experience standpoint, if you look at the last 36 months or so, we've been involved in more than 30 clinical programs with cell and gene therapy. These encompass all phases, including first-in-man studies, all the way to pivotal registration ongoing trials. In fact, this month alone, we had 2 first-in-man immuno-oncology cell-based programs that were treated here in the U.S. The therapeutic areas, as I mentioned earlier, are quite wide: cardiology, endocrinology, gastroenterology, hematology, oncology, neurology, ophthalmology, surgery, and virology. We find that about 20% of all the clinical programs we're working on right now involve pediatrics and specifically neonates. A number of our gene therapy programs are looking actually at newborns and looking at the ability to diagnose and start therapy before these diseases have the ability to cause any permanent long-term damage. We do work closely with the regulatory authorities and are able to provide support on orphan drug designation, fast-track designation, or breakthrough designation. And in the course of a 12-month period, as many as 2 to 3 dozen of those designations are achieved on behalf of our sponsors. And as I mentioned, we do tend to work with some of the same regulators, both in Europe and North America, over and over again. To give you a sense of the type of cells and gene therapy approaches that we're looking at, the vectors, I think it would be fair to say that if you sit in a conference like this one, at CTI we've been involved in just about all of these at one shape, form, or another. Going back historically, the company has a very long, rich history in solid organ transplantation, and that led us into a lot of the cell and gene therapy work over the last 10 years or so. This just gives you a listing of active cell therapy programs, and as I alluded to earlier, these go from very small, early first-in-man studies where there's almost always a data monitoring committee, sometimes reviewing every subject's enrollment before allowing us to dose escalate or move into the next cohort, to ones that are multinational with very large numbers of subjects involved, up to 500 patients. And examples also on the gene therapy side. And I'm happy to say that a number of our gene therapy programs have now moved into pivotal registration studies. And I would anticipate literally by this time next year, we may have some of these companies having already filed their applications for review and approval. Just to highlight a couple of the cell and gene therapy programs, I think some of the biggest challenges around these programs are identifying the subjects, making sure that the sites and investigators are chosen appropriately, making sure that there's a good understanding of all the regulatory review committees that have to be in place at the academic institutions. And I should point out that these are almost exclusively studies that are done at academic institutions. Unlike other areas of research, I think when it comes to cell and gene therapy, at least at this stage, our recommendation is generally to not go to some of the community-based practices, with a few exceptions. We find, for instance, orthopedics is one where there are some really good centers with a lot of infrastructure in the community-based practices that can do these studies. I also wanted to highlight, I think one of the things that's really key is standpoint of budgeting. We find in general that these cell and gene therapy studies can cost as much as 10 times a typical small molecule type study, and there's multiple reasons for that. But I think it's something that's really important early on. If you go in with a budget for a particular research site that may be based on some other studies that are not cell and gene-based, frequently what happens is either you're very disappointed, the contracts take a long time to be negotiated, or ultimately you negotiate a contract and the centers are not very financially motivated. They may be academically motivated, but they aren't big enrollers in your trials, and then ultimately everyone's disappointed. I mentioned this earlier, and I think a couple of these were actually presented earlier this morning as part of presentations, and I think the other one is part of tomorrow's presentation. But we are seeing in these gene therapy programs, multinational gene therapy programs, which really present some interesting logistical challenges that I'll speak to in a moment. But there's two approaches to this. One is to open sites in multiple countries and go through multiple regulatory authorities in order to receive their feedback and review an ultimate approval of the protocols. The other one that we're seeing more and more sponsors go to is to choose just a handful of research sites in a region. So for instance, for us right now, we're having really good results in Southeast Asia and Singapore. We're having obviously great results in the U.S., in Brazil, in 2 or 3 places in Western Europe on these gene therapy programs. And as such, especially for some of the rare disease programs, we will only open 4 to 6 sites and actually transport subjects and their families to those sites. And we find that to be more cost-effective and actually a more efficient way to recruit subjects. This just shows you an example of one program where subjects from 10 different countries traveled to 7 sites. And you can see for this group of just a handful of patients, there were actually more than 170,000 miles traveled. And so in some ways, you end up being as much a travel agent or coordinator as you do becoming a research analyst or partner on behalf of the sponsor company. Lastly, just to speak to the company's stability, one thing that happens frequently when we're talking with a biotech company early on is we know this is a really critical decision on their part as far as which company they partner their research efforts with, which may go forward for many years. As an 18-year-old privately held company, we average double-digit growth, whether it's looking at revenue, projects, sponsors, or employees over the last 6, 7, 8, 9 years. Our geographic expansion, as I mentioned, is now on all continents except Antarctica, and we're looking for that sponsor who wants to do some work there. But right now, we average 2 to 3 new countries where CTI incorporates and adds local employees with local regulatory expertise each year. From a financial standpoint, we may be one of the few companies at this meeting that actually are not looking for funding. We do have an experienced management team which has been in place for 15 years. And in our industry where there are companies that go up and down in size, we're very proud of the fact that we've had no layoffs in our company history. So hopefully the message take home here is we feel like that CTI is the leading clinical research organization to be your partner in the cell and gene therapy arena. We feel like we have more experience and more success than anyone else, and we appreciate the opportunity to tell the story. Thank you.